Hello everyone, welcome back on stage 2 at Privacy Conference 2021. Now after our break, we'll start with our first panel this afternoon on stage 2. Stage 2, not stage 1. I'm glad to introduce our three panelists for this for our panel discussion with the title Advancing Pseudonymization with a Universal Code of Conduct. With me today on this panel are Dr. Sachiko Scheuing, who is European Privacy Officer at Acxiom. There is also Steffen Weiß, who is member of the Board for International Affairs at the German Association for Data Protection and Data Security, also called GDD. And finally, last but not least, there's Frank Ingenrieth, who is the Deputy Managing Director of SRIW. Wonderful, here we are. First things first, I would ask you, Steffen, if you want, you brought us some slides to start with sharing those slides, and then you can give us a brief introduction of the topic and show us what this panel discussion will be about. And after this brief introduction with the slides, we will then start an interactive discussion, all four of us. Thank you already.
Thank you, David. Thank you for your kind introduction. I want to take this opportunity to introduce you to our code of conduct on the use of GDPR compliant pseudonymization. So I want to talk about the main pillars of our code, since we do not have too much time, but I just want to introduce you to the contents and also let you know what the stakeholders involved on this project. So let me start with the, let's call it the main content of the code. The code itself, what is it? What's the idea of the code? The main approach we're following is we want to stipulate requirements for controllers and processors on the pseudonymization of personal data. And hereby we want to enhance the transparency decision-making and to help managing the pseudonymization process. So first of all, looking at the scope of our code of conduct, we are addressing both controllers and processors. So either you're in control of the data processing or are you acting as a processor acting on the instructions of a controller, you can use this code of conduct to show that you're in compliance with GDPR provisions. The second goal we had was to enhance transparency. Why is that? Because the transparency has been an issue when it comes to pseudonymization. We had many isolated approaches when it comes to pseudonymization. This was my my reception in Germany and how I see the things there. And that's why we decided to make this decision-making more transparent by including the requirements in a code of conduct which is accessible by the public. And also we wanted to help managing through the pseudonymization process. What kind of checkpoints do I have to go through when I decide to pseudonymize personal data under the GDPR? And this is the main approach and the main goal of our code of conduct. It helps to manage the process. It does not stipulate how to pseudonymize, if you shall use the HMAC or a hash or any other function to pseudonymize personal data. It's all about handling the pseudonymization process. This is our main goal to support either processors or controllers on the market. So the key features of the code of conduct are, for example, the specialist responsible for pseudonymization. We want to assign responsibilities and we want to have one person overseeing the pseudonymization process. So he or she should be able to control the process and be aware of the measures, the mitigation measures or pseudonymization measures being involved in the whole process. This is where everything comes together. Then we also have defined pseudonymization criteria. I should call it the pseudonymization blender. So these are criteria which you take into the pseudonymization blender, and at the end, you should find a suitable pseudonymization technique under GDPR. What are the criteria involved in this pseudonymization blender? It's, of course, type and risk, a category of personal data. Is it sensitive information according to Article 9? Is it customer data? Are we talking about health data? So these types and risk classes have to be defined. Then we also talk about the purpose of processing. Is my main goal of pseudonymization to protect assets, personal data and information, or is it about maybe the further processing of personal data under Article 6, Paragraph 4? Then also the context of processing is important. Am I doing this in line of performance or execution of contract between me and the customer, or is it another context of pseudonymization? Because in the end, we're all accountable of what we do, and this also applies to pseudonymization. In the end, this code will help you to demonstrate compliance with the law by going through these mandatory criteria. Also, number of data sets is important because not each and every pseudonymization technique is suitable for a vast amount of personal data. Also, the needed types of pseudonyms need to be defined and documented if you want to comply with the code. There are different pseudonyms available. So we talk about relationship pseudonyms, we talk about personal pseudonyms. And in the end, you have to make up your mind, what kind of pseudonym do I really need to achieve my personal data processing goals and purposes? Also, privacy by design and by default. We talk especially about data minimization. And in case you are pseudonymizing personal data, you have to select a suitable measure that makes you easily select data, but also easily delete data in order to comply with the privacy by design and by default principle. Then we also have checkpoints, other checkpoints which you need to go through when applying the code. Why are these checkpoints in the code? Because pseudonymized data is, in a nutshell, personal data according to GDPR. That's why you have to go through all the checkpoints. In case you're transferring personal pseudonymized data to third countries, you need to go past this checkpoint. You need to make up your mind about re-identification of data subjects. In which cases am I planning and envisaging to re-identify data subjects? You need to document it according to the requirements of the code. You need to implement access controls, appropriate access controls to protect the pseudonyms, to protect the information available to re-identify the data subject, because this is very important when we're talking about pseudonymization. It is always possible to re-identify the data subject, but you need to store this information separately, and you need proper access controls to protect that data. Data breach is an issue in case there's a reversal of pseudonymization. We need to think of a process and have established a process of notifying the supervisory authority in case there's a risk to the data subject. Necessity of processing, even though it's just pseudonymized data, you have to be aware of that in case you don't need the personal data anymore. Think of the data protection foundations and principles in Article 5. You need to delete that data. And that's why this is a mandatory checkpoint to go through in our code. Consultation of DPA, supervisory authorities, is a bit of a smaller requirement we have in case you have a data protection impact assessment, and pseudonymization is a mitigation measure. You might have to consult the DPA, the supervisory authority. That's why we have this checkpoint. And last but not least, we have certain technical transformation requirements in that code. We do not say that one pseudonymization technique is the best for all solutions, because it is a comprehensive code of conduct for each and every sector. But we have established certain best practices on a technical transformation process. And there's other support around, especially from ENISA, when it comes to really establishing the techniques for pseudonymizing personal data. Last but not least, we also have good practices in the code. What is that? Because the code is universal, we needed certain sector-specific examples how to apply that code. And in our code, you will find good practices for pseudonymization in certain scenarios or sectors. We have good practices on analytics. We have good practices on direct marketing. Sachiko will talk about this later on. We'll have an example of health data trustee services using pseudonymized information. And we also have, last but not least, requirements for pseudonymization software, because such software is evolving at the moment. There are many vendors on the market trying to sell pseudonymization software. And that's why we decided to establish a good practice. What does a software to pseudonymize data need in order to comply with that code? Regarding the stakeholders, we have two code owners at the moment. We have GED and Bitkom, which will be the code owners of the Code of Conduct on Pseudonymization. We will have, of course, the signatories, the companies and organizations willingly to comply with the code, signing the code. We will have a monitoring body, SRIW Scope Europe, that's where Frank comes in place, trying to monitor and monitoring the Code of Conduct, which is an important asset, looking at the GDPR. And we have some sort of governance structure. We'll have a general assembly where the companies signing the code will have a vote when it comes to code changes. And we have a steering board with an oversight activity, which is trying to propose changes to the code. And then the General Assembly will be able to approve them or not in the end. This shall be it for now, the small introduction on our code. I'll hand it over to David.
Steffen and all of you, thank you very much for this brief introduction into your pseudo COC. I will from now on use that abbreviation if I may. I think that's what I also saw on the slides. It makes it a bit easier to spell it out. Speaking about that part of pseudonymization, Sachiko, maybe you can just to give us a bit of a kind of introduction again into, let's take a step back, I would say. Can you explain very briefly, why do we need pseudonymization? Like, what is the technical kind of necessity that requires us to do this? What problem does it solve, I would ask?
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. And I'm not really sure if I like the pseudo COC because it sounds like it's not a real code of conduct, but never mind, I know what you mean. Before I actually answer that question, I think it is a good idea for me to just stress the point that Steffen likely touched upon, which is about the fact that the GDPR, I think a lot of people sort of forget about this fact, but it is actually a risk-based law. So in other words, the more you protect, the more protective measures you put in place, the lower the risk of to the data subject, which means you can do more, you can be more flexible in the way you use the data. And Steffen, you mentioned Article 6.4 with the recital 50. Indeed, I think that's one area that one should really sort of put a focus on, because that back in that time used to be referred to the big data provision. And the thing is, you can actually use data for purposes other than the original purpose for which the data has been collected. But there are several conditions, of course, and one of them is the provision of appropriate safeguard. Now, here, the pseudonymous data code of conduct comes really into play, and it's going to be of paramount importance because Article 6.4e specifically calls out pseudonymization as being one such safeguard. So I think that's one point. And then, David, now back to your question. You see, the lucky thing about us is that those of us who have been doing marketing in Germany, the concept of pseudonymization, although new, was actually there for a decade in Germany. So we had time to actually develop many a construction that would allow increased protection, but yet to be able to use the data for commercial purposes. And now in the GDPR era, we are seeing that we have in the marketing sector mostly two legal grounds. Now, one of them is consent. I think it is quite obvious because everybody must be bombarded by, hey, do you accept, do you click, do you agree, and all that, on your devices and so on. But the other ground is a legitimate interest, Article 6.1f. And I think if you have carried out legitimate interest assessment, I think you would resonate with what I say. But better protection of data is ultimately going to lead to less risk of rights and freedom of the data subject. So, so this is also an area that I say, hey, no matter what you do, adding another protection is a good thing. And let me now finally give an example of my area. So my company is a marketing services company. And we have marketing departments of many of different brands that are wanting to carry out marketing campaign. And when they do so, what typically happens is they send several files. Like, let's take an example of an automotive manufacturer. So they will send over their CRM files, so the customer relationship files, so their main communication file. And then they will send another file from dealer A, dealer B from Frankfurt, dealer C from Berlin, whatever. And then they will say, please carry out a campaign. So step one is all the incoming files. What we do is we pseudonymize. So and delete the direct identifiers. In the next step, would be to create a master file to be used for that particular campaign. And to do so, what one do is one compare the files, and to make sure that the same person doesn't appear twice. We call it the duplication process. So for instance, if Emma Schmidt from Park Street in Frankfurt is in dealer A's file, but also in dealer B from Berlin's file, then we don't want to send mailing materials. Like typically, they do really nice glossy brochures and so on. So it's quite expensive too. So they want to make sure that they only send one per person. So you delete it. So in the next step, that file, the deduplicated master file, is going to be suppressed, meaning there are general opt-out files. There are also files which say that car manufacturer has used in a campaign 2 weeks ago, and you don't want to send, you don't want to communicate the same message, in such short intervals. So you also want to make sure that those people don't get the material. So there too, pseudonymize first, and then suppress them, and so on and so forth. And then once the file is complete, it would actually be sent over from the analytics department to the delivery department, which have the so-called additional information to convert the pseudonymized master files to the fulfillment agency. Sometimes this this actually delivery can happen through another third party. And this is the reason why this is how it would actually go to the fulfillment agencies. I'm just thinking, time-wise, am I still all right? Do I have like 2 more minutes?
I think that's fine. We didn't allocate time in advance. You can, but the next question would be for Frank. So feel free to finish when you feel you said what you want to say.
Okay, because I was actually also telling Steffen and Frank during the preparatory session that maybe it is also relevant for many people to think about the fact that the world, particularly in the digital advertisement field, has changed a lot, in the sense that we have had Google and Apple announcing the death of third-party cookie, which has been the basis of all digital advertisement. So interestingly, what happened was, because of that, a lot of brands have been really aware of the fact that, hey, we really need to take privacy into consideration, data protection into consideration. So they're actually taking more of an approach that they will have more control over marketing activities. And one of the things that is currently growing is the second-party data marketing. I don't know whether you have heard about it, David, but it is, in a way, you have, see, that car manufacturer that I just spoke short time ago, and let's say a soft drink company. They want to actually do, they actually want to do a marketing campaign. So the soft drink company actually goes to the car manufacturer and say, hey, can I advertise my my product to your customers, where my customer is your customer, type of deal thing?
I see. Sachiko, thank you so far for this for your elaborations and your insights here.
Sorry, just one thing. Just a conclude. Yeah, exactly. Because the concluding messages, of course, are missing. The concluding message is a lot more use of pseudonymization is going to take place, and I think it is going to increase as third-party cookies that would disappear. Therefore, I think for us it is a really great initiative that we are having this code of conduct for pseudonymization. That there's clarity, there are checkpoints that we actually can go through, so that we as a user of the code of conduct can have legal certainty. And sorry about this. Back over to you, David.
Thank you so much for this, Sachiko. So what I take, Steffen, from yours and Sachiko from your two interventions is that this code of conduct solves an important issue by kind of clarifying and putting into place a set of rules to follow in order to simply apply pseudonymization techniques in business. And I also hear that it is highly relevant in many different business and use cases these days. Taking that, Frank, what do you think? How, I wonder, isn't this like, people could say, is this just another set of rules I have to follow? How does this COC actually, like, how do I enforce it? That's something I would wonder for myself. And then this seems to be a very complicated exercise because you're essentially creating new rules. So maybe you can also let us know about the experience that you maybe had with this in the past already and how this could have informed the work on the pseudonymization COC that you're presenting today.
Very happy to provide you with some information in this regard. And also thank you for the question. And I think I can perfectly continue with Steffen and Sachiko's statements. Because first of all, you have to understand two perspectives. The one is the enforcement and the incentives that GDPR provides. And the second is, why does it perfectly fit to pseudonymization? That's also one of the reasons why GDPR provides pseudonymization as one of the examples where GDPR considers codes of conduct to be relevant. So first of all, what's our experience in how this kind of rule setting and enforcement can look like? So the SRIW and Scope Europe has been explicitly founded to monitor and manage codes of conduct. And we have been spending more than a decade right now to streamline the processes and to make really sure that it works in practice. That resulted, for example, into the EU Cloud Code of Conduct that has been the first transnational code under the GDPR that has been ever approved. And Scope Europe is therefore also the first accredited monitoring body, I will touch on that later, under GDPR that was accredited for a transnational code of conduct. Why is that important? Both the approval under GDPR and the accreditation of a monitoring body. Both is required so that you can use the incentives under GDPR that codes of conduct provide. And that's something where codes of conduct also have an advantage against certifications. Sachiko and Steffen has touched on this topic, data protection impact assessments. So GDPR is somehow about risk assessments. And if the risk for the data subject is too high, you have to implement mitigating measures. The code of conduct, as Steffen provided, defines the procedures, so to say a management process on how to determine the appropriate pseudonymization process. If you have done so, and if you're adherent and monitored by an external party that's verifying that you're following this process, you can also use the adherence to that code of conduct within your data protection impact assessment. Because the data protection impact assessment refers to codes of conduct and only to codes of conduct as an additional mitigating measure to reduce the risks for the data subject. And why codes of conduct are there in this regard? Because there is an independent monitoring body. Monitoring bodies have to be accredited and have to prove that they have the sufficient qualification and expertise and that they are independent from the companies they are monitoring. And by that, they are ensuring that whatever the codes of conduct requires is been implemented. And is that new rules? Sachiko explained this. Principally, the code doesn't provide any new rules. It's more or less documenting and gathering the rules that have been implemented by European companies throughout the last decades. It's more or less putting them down and putting them into a framework so that the companies can use the incentives under GDPR. And this is also something you have to understand from the procedural point of view and why this code has the checkpoints that Steffen had. We have been streamlining the monitoring procedures and the enforcement procedures over the decades. And what we figured out is we can, on the one hand, the more precise the rules, the better. On the other hand, pseudonymization applies to a variety of sectors, be it health, be it advertising, be it also research, be it whatever you name it. Pseudonymization is the core processing activity in almost any sectors out there. So therefore, we couldn't define in that code of conduct what's the perfect measure, but we could define a management process. And as we have to monitor and verify that this process has been followed, the code defines thorough documentation obligations. So we at the monitoring body can now assess whether the company has followed the checkpoint, has documented its independent determinations of risks of suitable solutions, and provided that this is within the scope of, let's say, plausibility or acceptance, this is good to go. If a company has a lack of documentation, or if documentation is in a way that it's obviously not fitting a balance of interests, we at the monitoring will interfere and make this company take remediate actions or even delist this company from being adherent to the code. So that's this kind of environment of codes of conduct.
Thank you so much for this. I think this was again super helpful to further understand also the mechanisms that accompany this code of conduct to put it into practice. So we have a few minutes left. I wonder, Steffen, maybe you can share something about that. If I run a business, for example, or what could I do in order to get involved there? And also, I wonder, what is the current status of the COC? Because I can imagine that there are lots of steps that you've already taken and that there are more steps to come.
So in the current status we are in this project, we have some sort of core of companies willing to later on adhere to the code. We needed these companies because we wanted to address different sectors of processing activities. That's why we have the good practices. That's why we have different companies being involved in the description of these good practices. The next step would be to seek for approval at the supervisory authority, which would be the Belgian supervisory authority. But as a first step, we will try to make it an informal request at the supervisory authority in order to find out if there are any obstacles in view of the authority which would lead to a decline of approval. This will be the first step, which is now taking place. And afterwards, we'll seek for the formal approval by the Belgian authority. And then after the consistency mechanism, we will have, hopefully, this transnational comprehensive code of conduct on pseudonymization. And then you as a company would be able to sign this code, being a signatory, as Frank mentioned. And then you would be subject to the monitoring activities by SRIW or Scope Europe in this latter case. And you would have to adhere to the code. But as I said before, we want to actively involve the company. So in case we suggest code changes to the steering board, the companies being the subject of these changes, they will need to approve it. And they can tell us in the General Assembly meeting if this is a measure, a recommendation which is suitable in the pseudonymization process or not. And this is our main goal, to actively involve all the stakeholders and especially controllers and processors who are processing personal data and are pseudonymizing personal data and generating pseudonyms.
I see.
If you ask me about timeframes, it's hard to tell because in this informal procedure, Frank is the expert in that case. It's hard to tell how much time it takes for the supervisory authority to tell us possible obstacles. If we approach it with an informal request for approval, there is a time limit, but during this informal procedure, it's difficult to tell. Hopefully, we'll have first results at the end of the year about how the supervisory authority sees our code, if it really fits into the requirements of a code of conduct, which needs to specify certain requirements of the GDPR, which I have to tell you, it is hard to argue and hard to really establish specific rules under the GDPR, which are in compliance with the view of the supervisory authorities.
I see. Steffen, thank you. I think this was again super helpful to also understand the dynamics that are at play when it comes to the regulatory context and to the next steps in the process of this to put this COC into practice. I see that time has run very fast. We are now already at the end of this short panel, as I'm afraid. I do want to thank all three of you for your time and for explaining this important project to us that you're working on with other companies together, with other stakeholders. We would like to continue that dialogue in the future, and maybe you can, if there's anything else you want to say for the last few seconds, feel free to do so. Otherwise, I would again thank you for your time.